Hi, in this video clip, I will explain how to QA roof type using multiple labels. Here's the list of topics covered in this video. First, I will briefly review the definition of the pure roof types and hybrid roofs. Then I'll explain how to handle attached extensions, when to use other and unknown, how to interpret the red outline, and finally, I will summarize the key points in this video. Now first, let's review the pure roof types. There are 4 of them: flat, hip, gable, and Dutch gable. By now, you should be already very familiar with these roof types. I will only mention a few more things to re-emphasize the key points. Remember, for our purpose, we consider pyramid roof a hip. We also consider half hip a gable. So half hip looks like a gable with its corner cut off. In this case, we ignore the small modification here and consider the whole thing the same as gable. Lastly, on Dutch gable, remember the definition is there's a gable section that's sitting on top of a hip section, and the end of the gable must be on the hip line. That's Dutch gable. These are the 4 primary pure roof types. There are many other roof types as well, such as gambrel, shed, mansard, and maybe other things I have not covered so far. But for our purpose, all other roof types are lumped under one category that's called other. So when you see an image that is any one of the pure roof types, then it's very simple. Just select the single type and that's it. Next, let's look at how to handle hybrid roof types. So here are some examples. A hybrid roof is a roof that has more than one roof type. When you see a hybrid roof, the rule is to select all the roof types you see in that image. In general, there are 2 situations where you may see hybrid roofs. The first one is a relatively large house with multiple sections. In this case, one section is gable and the other section is hip. Another situation is where you see a house with some extension structure. For example, here you may have a garage that's right next to the house. In both cases, again, the rule is to select all the roof types you see in the picture. So in the first example, select gable and hip. And in the second example, select flat and gable. That's how the rule works. Now let me show you how you can actually do this using our QA website. Now you're in the website. Make sure before you start to QA for roof type, the tile label is set to QA roof type. Now let's look at the first image. In this one, you have a hip roof that's surrounded by flat extensions. You need to select hip and flat. Click on the tile label and make sure you check both hip and flat. And after you do that, you see flat and hip showing up in the tile label. Let's look at another example where you have gable and flat. In this case, similarly, click on the tile label to see the drop-down menu. Make sure you select both gable and flat. In this case, gable is already checked, so you only need to check flat. If you checked also something else by mistake, for instance, Dutch gable, then all you need to do is to click on Dutch gable again, and then it will disappear. Now flat and gable are correctly selected. Depending on the version of the product you use, sometimes you may see this red star next to the tile label. This does not mean anything. Just ignore it. Also, depending on the version of the product you use, you may see multiple imagery sources, for instance, Google and Nearmap. Most of the time, the different image sources should tell you the same answer. In rare cases where they actually give you a different answer, you should go with Nearmap. So for instance, if the Nearmap image is showing a gable and a hip roof, then the label should be gable and hip, and in that case, you ignore what Google tells you. So you keep going like this and make sure you review all the images on the page, and in the end, make sure at the bottom of the page you click Approve All. If you don't click Approve All, the results will not be registered and you will not be paid for the images on this page. So it's very important you click Approve All on every page. So that's how the rule works. It's actually pretty straightforward. Now let's look at more examples. So here are more examples. In this one, you have gable, hip, and also be careful, there's a tiny flat extension here. So the correct answer should be gable, hip, flat. In this example, you have hip and gable here, so it's gable and hip. This one is a little tricky. It's mostly gable, but pay attention to this corner here. At this corner, you actually have this hip line that goes diagonally to the corner. So this corner is actually hip. Therefore, this is gable and hip. In this example, you have a hip roof with 3 dormer sections on top of the hip roof, and these dormer sections are gable. Therefore, the label should be hip and gable. In this example, first of all, clearly you see 2 hip sections at both ends. The center part may look like a gable, but it's not, because remember the definition of a gable is the 2 sloping sections should go all the way to the end of the building. In this case, they didn't. They stopped at the intersection with the hip sections. Therefore, the center part is not gable. We can consider the entire thing hip. In this example, these are half hips. So as I explained earlier, we consider half hips gable. So both of these are just gable. So some more things to ignore. In this example, you have a small, tiny circular section here. Ignore that and look at the rest of the building, which is pure gable. In this one, you have a small lifted section here. Again, ignore that and look at the rest of the building, which is hip only. This example is very tricky. First of all, you have Dutch gable sections here and here. Then it may be hard to notice there's also a flat triangle section here. And lastly, pay attention to this corner here. This corner is actually a hip corner because you have this hip line going diagonally to the corner. Therefore, the correct answer for this is Dutch gable, flat, and hip. This one, similarly very complicated. You have Dutch gable, you have a hip at the bottom, and then you have gable here. So that's Dutch gable, hip, and gable. This example, very hard to see, but you have a hip here, and then a tiny bit of Dutch gable here. So it's hip and Dutch gable. Sometimes the roofs are partially covered by trees. In that case, if the visible area is sufficient for you to actually make a call, you should still label them according to the visible area. So in this case, it is gable and a small hip section here, gable and hip. Similarly, in this one, you have gable and hip. This is another example where part of the building is covered by tree or shade. So in this example, the visible part is mostly hip, but pay attention to this part here where you have a flat extension that's in the shade and not easy to see. But make sure you capture that, and the label should be hip and flat. Okay, so those are some examples. Next, let me explain how to handle attached extensions. First of all, attached extensions must be physically connected to the main roof. And in that case, you should look at both the main roof and the attached extensions to identify all the roof types and then select all the labels. You should ignore extensions that are not attached. So let me show you some example. This one clearly you have an extension, flat extension, that is physically connected to the main roof. So it is a attached extension, and the correct label should be hip and flat. gable and flat. In this example, there's a gap between this extension structure and the main roof. Therefore, you ignore the detached extension and only look at the main roof, which is gable. In this example, there is also a gap, but the extension is actually connected to the main roof by this narrow strip here. Therefore, it is an attached extension, and the label should be gable and flat. This one, clearly, the extension structure, which looks like a barn, is separated from the main building. Therefore, ignore this and just look at the main building. In this example, again, you have some separate structure in the courtyard. Ignore it and only look at the main part, which is gable and flat. So that's how to handle attached extensions. Now let's look at when to use unknown and other. First of all the general rules about unknown still apply. So for instance, if you see a picture that shows a piece of farmland or a parking lot, or the image is too blurry for you to tell anything, then you should label the entire thing as unknown. And you may also use other in combination with other roof types. So for instance, in this picture, you have this part which is shed, and therefore we call that other, and this part which is flat. So together, the correct label for this one is other and flat. Now in practice, I understand this is very hard to identify because from the top, it's very hard to see shed roof types. But if you see one, then the way to do it is to label this as other and flat. Lastly, let's also review again how to interpret the red outline. Now, please understand the red outline is there for you to focus on the right building, especially in cases where there are many buildings that are next to each other. So for instance, in this case, this red box shows you this is the part of the building that you are supposed to evaluate and ignore the other buildings. But also be aware the red outline is not precise, which means sometimes the red outline may include objects that you are supposed to ignore. For instance, in this case, the red outline includes this tiny structure here that is separated from the main building. Therefore, this is not an attached extension. You should ignore this and only look at the main part, which is hip and gable. Conversely, sometimes the red outline may miss objects that you are supposed to look at. For instance, here, it missed this flat extension that is connected to the hip roof. Therefore, this one should be labeled hip and flat. So that's everything I wanted to cover. Lastly, let's summarize the key points. First of all, make sure you look at the main roof and attached extensions. You should select all the roof types you observe on the main roof as well as the attached extensions. And you ignore extensions that are not attached, which means they are physically separated from the main roof. Now you should focus on the building that's touched by the red outline, but be aware the red outline can include too many objects or miss objects. Lastly, when Google and Nearmap images give different answers, use Nearmap. That's all. Thanks for watching.